I remember the descent more than anything else. The shuttle felt like a metal coffin suspended by cables, dropping inch by inch into a darkness so complete it erased all sense of direction. The windows showed nothing except the faint glow of the surface lights fatting above me. Once they disappeared, I was surrounded by a cold pressure that felt alive. My ears popped from the compression, and the floor vibrated in slow pulses, like something brushing the outside of the hull. No one spoke during the descent. The pilot kept their eyes fixed forward the entire time. They had the look of someone who had done this far too many times. At one point, the shuttle jolted, not from turbulence but from something solid shifting water nearby. The pilot froze. They waited a few seconds before continuing the descent. They never explained what happened. The lights of the deep-sea facility appeared below us like a cluster of dim stars. They flickered in a slow rhythm, not mechanical, more like breathing. The shuttle docked with a metallic thud and a hiss of pressure equalizing. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a corridor lined with rust, condensation, and a faint chemical smell. The air was colder than I expected, colder than it had any reason to be inside a sealed structure. A woman in a dark uniform waited at the docking platform. She gave me a short nod and handed me a badge. She spoke quickly. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. She told me my duties, my schedule, and where to sleep. The whole time her voice shook in small, uneven tremors. When she finished, she pressed a folded sheet of paper into my hand. "These are the rules," she said. Her eyes stayed locked on mine for a moment, not with authority, with warning. Then she turned and walked away, almost jogging toward the elevator. I unfolded the paper. It was wrinkled and smudged with oil stains. 10 rules were printed in simple text. Some made sense at first. Stay within marked security routes. Report alarms immediately. Keep emergency lights charged. But others made the hairs on my arms rise. Rule 4 said to ignore any tapping on the external walls during night shifts. Rule 6 warned to avoid looking directly into the observation windows after 02:00. Rule 9 advised checking reflective surfaces twice if alone. None of these rules came with explanations. A low vibration moved through the metal floor. It felt deliberate, like something brushing past the outer hull again. I looked around, expecting someone to react, but the workers in the nearby corridor continued moving without hesitation. They didn't even glance toward the sound. I followed the path to the security office. The facility was larger than it looked from the outside. The hallways stretched narrow and long, lined with thick pipes and flickering ceiling strips. Every so often I saw a reinforced window showing the ocean outside. Not a single fish or shape passed by. Just endless black water pressing in from all directions. In the security office, I met my supervisor, a quiet man with a shaved head and deep shadows under his eyes. He explained how the cameras were mapped, which decks I was responsible for, and where the blind spots were. He paused often, as if forgetting certain pieces of information before remembering them again. When I asked about the rules, he scratched the back of his head and said the facility changed them when needed. When needed for what? I asked. He didn't answer. My first patrol started an hour later. I walked through dim corridors where lights buzzed like dying insects. The quiet felt unnatural in a place filled with machines. No hums, no fans, only the distant groans of metal under pressure. I passed a window and stopped. Something massive drifted through the water far below the facility. I could see only the suggestion of movement, a ripple, a shifting shadow. When I blinked, it was gone. My radio crackled, not with speech, with static that bent upward like a whisper. I checked the channel. It was open, but no one was speaking. The sound continued for a few seconds before cutting off sharply. I waited for a call from the supervisor but heard nothing. During the patrol, I reached a sector where the air felt colder. Condensation dripped from the pipes even though the humidity sensors showed nothing out of the ordinary. I felt watched. There was no other word for it. I kept glancing behind me but saw nothing except long, empty hallways and the faint shine of wet metal. When my shift ended, I returned to my cabin. I set the rule sheet on the desk and went to wash my hands. When I came back, I froze. The sheet looked different. Rule 3 had changed. I remembered it saying to report any flickering in emergency lights. Now it read something else entirely. Rule 3: if you hear footsteps matching your own pace, do not stop walking. Return to a lit area immediately. I stared at the paper for a long time. The text was normal, not rewritten or erased, as if it had always said that. I checked the door, locked. No one could have entered. I sat on the bed and listened to the deep pressure groaning through the facility. It came in slow pulses from the ocean outside. Every time the metal flexed, I felt it resonate through the floor and into my chest. The lights in my cabin flickered once. Just once, but long enough to make the room feel smaller. I picked up the rule sheet again. My hands shook. I read the lines one more time, waiting to see if anything else would shift. Everything stayed still. For the moment, I lay down on the thin mattress and closed my eyes, but the vibration from the ocean never stopped. It continued in steady waves, as if something large circled the facility. Something curious, something patient. When I finally drifted into a restless half-sleep, I had one thought repeating again and again. I should not have come down here. Not for any job. Not for any amount of money. But the descent was over. The doors were sealed. The pressure outside could crush a human body in seconds. There was no going back. Only surviving whatever waited in the dark water pressing against the walls. My second day at the facility passed in a strange blur. Every hallway felt the same. Every room hummed with the same pressure in the walls. By the time my first real night shift arrived, I had memorized the path from the security office to the observation decks, yet I still felt lost. The entire structure seemed designed to confuse anyone who wasn't born inside it. At 23:00, my supervisor handed me a flashlight thicker than my wrist and told me to run a full level 2 patrol. He said it like a routine instruction, but the way he avoided eye contact suggested something else. When I asked what made a level 2 patrol different, he only said that things tend to move around more after dark. I wanted clarification. I didn't get any. The patrol route began at the North Observation Hall. The corridor leading to it was narrow and cold, with metal walls streaked by condensation trails that dripped in slow, rhythmic beats. The air smelled faintly metallic, like water that had sat too long in rusted pipes. I walked slowly, letting the flashlight cut through the darkness. When I reached the first observation window, I paused. The glass was thick and reinforced with bolted steel. Beyond it was nothing but ocean, a black void. Occasionally, a ripple of motion passed through the water, but the shapes vanished before I could identify them. I didn't know whether they were real or tricks of my tired eyes. Halfway down the hallway, the floor vibrated, a heavy, distant impact. The sound traveled through the structure in a deep, slow roll. It wasn't the normal groaning of pressure. It felt targeted, like a massive object brushing the hull. Rule 4 came to mind. Ignore any tapping on the external walls during night shifts. This wasn't tapping. This was something larger, something testing the metal. I continued walking even though my chest tightened with each step. Past the observation area was a maintenance junction with overhead pipes that stretched in tangled patterns. The lights here flickered in uneasy pulses. I kept my flashlight trained on the far door. The sound of dripping echoed from somewhere deep inside the ventilation system. I took another step. Then another. Behind me, footsteps. I didn't breathe at first. The sound matched my pace exactly. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I moved, they moved. I remembered Rule 3. If you hear footsteps matching your own pace, do not stop walking. Return to a lit area immediately. My hands shook as I turned back toward the brighter corridor I had come from. The footsteps continued behind me, mimicking every step. I kept my eyes forward even though every instinct told me to look. I reached the lit zone and felt the pressure behind me disappear. The footsteps stopped. The air felt lighter. I didn't turn around until the lights were steady again. Nothing stood in the corridor. Just long darkness and the slow pulse of water pressing against the structure. I took a moment to steady my breathing before continuing toward the lower decks. The stairwells were narrow and colder than the hallways. My footsteps echoed in sharp metallic rings. The temperature dropped the farther I descended. Frost formed thin lines along the railing, though the facility logs claimed the temperatures were stable. Halfway down the stairwell, I heard something on the other side of the wall. A low, dragging scrape, followed by another. Then a long, slow breath. Not mechanical, not natural. Something alive was tracing the outer surface. The entire stairwell shook again. I gripped the railing and waited for the vibration to fade. When it did, I went down the next flight. My radio hissed once, then went silent. Deck 4 was darker than the others. Only 2 overhead strips worked, flickering like dying stars. Shadows clung to the corners and the walls. I scanned the hallway before stepping forward. This deck was closest to the external dredging systems. The walls trembled faintly from the turbines, though the poolsing didn't feel steady enough to be mechanical. It came in slow, rolling rhythms. Something moved behind the observation glass. Not quickly, not in a way meant to startle. A shape drifted into view, huge, wide, covered in faint glowing streaks like long bioluminescent scars. I couldn't make out its form, only the suggestion of a massive body sliding through the water. The glowing marks pulsed once, then again. Then they vanished into the darkness outside. I stood there frozen, my breath fogged in front of me. When I finally moved, my legs felt weak. I continued my patrol, trying to ignore the heavy pounding of my heart. At the far end of the deck was a sealed equipment room. The lock pad glowed red when I scanned my badge. It wasn't supposed to be locked during patrol. I knocked once to check for personnel inside. No answer. I tried the badge again, red. The room was dark behind the small window. Only the faintest glimmer of something metallic shone in the corner. I leaned closer. A shape inside moved. Not a person, too large, too fluid. The entire window fogged from the inside, as if something exhaled against it. I stepped back quickly. My radio crackled again, this time with a short, broken sentence. "Stay away. Do not engage. Keep moving." The voice was strained and distorted. I thought it was my supervisor, but the tone sounded wrong, stretched, like someone speaking with a mouth full of cold water. I responded, but the radio returned only static. As I turned away from the equipment room, the door groaned, not opening, just shifting. Something heavy on the other side dragged across the floor. I didn't wait to see what it was. I continued the patrol until I reached the south stairwell. The air here felt thicker, heavier, like it held weight. The sound of pressure outside deepened until it felt like my ears were clogged. Then everything went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that feels impossible. No water, no metal creaking, no air circulation, nothing. I froze at the bottom of the stairwell. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. Something enormous passed by the outer hull again, slow enough to feel, heavy enough to shift the ground beneath me. Then the lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The silence broke with a sudden loud crack in the pipes overhead. The noise snapped me out of place. I climbed the stairs fast, ignoring the cramping in my legs. My radio crackled one more time. "Shift complete, report back." The voice was flat, emotionless, not the supervisor, not anyone I recognized. When I reached the security office, the supervisor sat at his desk staring at his monitor. His face was pale. He didn't look up when I reported in. He only asked if I followed the rules. I told him yes. He exhaled in relief. Not satisfaction. Relief. I returned to my cabin. When I shut the door behind me, I saw the rules sheet on my desk again. I held my breath as I picked it up. Rule 5 had changed. It now read, "If something inside the facility knocks, do not answer. It is not requesting help." I set the paper down slowly and felt a chill crawl through my spine. Whatever was outside the walls was not the only thing I needed to fear. Something else was already in here. Something that knew the rules better than I did. I checked the time on my monitor and realized my shift had barely reached the halfway point. The place was quiet, too quiet. Even with the constant rumble of the deep-sea pressure systems behind the walls, the hallway felt hollow. I tried to distract myself by walking another patrol loop. It should have helped. It didn't. I moved past the observation deck, where the long viewing window showed nothing but dark water. That endless black always made me uncomfortable. It felt like something was sitting just beyond the glass, something that understood my fear better than I did. I kept going and tried to focus on the rules instead. The laminated sheet was in my pocket. I had read it at least 10 times since clocking in. I wanted to believe they were exaggerated corporate nonsense. The kind of thing a company writes because a lawyer told them to. But as I reached the central hub again, I saw that wasn't true. One of the alarm lights over the main hatch was blinking. It wasn't blaring. It wasn't urgent. Just a soft, steady pulse, like a heartbeat that didn't belong in this place. The hatch was sealed. The control panel beside it said everything was normal, pressure stable, locks engaged, no signs of entry. But the blinking continued. The rules came back to my mind. Rule 3. If you hear tapping on any hatch, do not investigate. I pressed my palm against the cold metal door. No tapping, no vibration, just the steady pulse of the warning light. I stood there for too long, long enough for unease to spread through my body like cold water. Something felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to step back. Then the tapping began. 3 slow taps from the other side, soft at first, almost gentle, like something testing the integrity of the metal. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back on instinct. The taps stopped. Silence returned. My heart was pounding and I tried to convince myself it was just pressure shifts, the ocean groans, the metal flexes, that kind of thing. But I knew deep down that wasn't what I heard. I backed away from the hatch and pulled out my radio. I wanted to call the control room and verify if anyone else was seeing this. Before I could speak, the radio crackled, and a voice I didn't recognize whispered a single word. "Window." The transmission cut instantly. Static filled the channel for a moment before going silent. My hands shook as I lowered the radio. The observation deck was the only place with a window, the same window I passed minutes earlier. I didn't want to go back there, but the job required me to check anything that might be a breach, and I was still pretending I cared about following protocol. I forced myself down the corridor. Each step felt heavier. The pressure groaned through the pipes overhead. The lights flickered and stabilized. Everything in this facility made noise, except the one noise that mattered. My footsteps. I stopped when I reached the viewing glass. The room looked normal. No alarms, no cracks, nothing unusual. Just that massive window staring into a world where light went to die. I approached slowly. Cold air rolled across the room and hit my face. The temperature wasn't supposed to drop here. The system kept everything regulated. My skin prickled. My breath fogged slightly. Something had changed. I stepped closer to the glass and looked out into the endless black. It was like staring into a void. A cold sinking feeling twisted in my stomach as I imagined shapes drifting out there. shapes that could swallow the entire facility. I leaned forward. Something blinked in the darkness outside. Not a light. An eye. A single glowing eye the size of a dinner plate. Pale blue, almost white. It blinked again. Slow, deliberate, focused on me. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The eye moved slightly and the faint silhouette of a massive figure shifted behind it. Something enormous drifted closer to the glass. Not swimming, hovering, like its body didn't need to obey the rules of the water. I staggered back. The thing outside followed my movement with calm precision. The eye never left mine. Another rule slid into my mind. Rule 6. If anything looks back at you from outside the observation window, leave immediately. I stepped back again. The creature in the black water pressed closer. A faint ripple of bioluminescent lines flickered along its shape. Its skin was rough and segmented like deep-sea armor. Its mouth was hidden in the dark, but I could see the faint rows of teeth catching the dim interior light. I forced myself to keep walking backward without turning my back on it. For a moment the creature drifted forward, then it stopped. Its eye widened slightly, almost curious. The moment my foot reached the doorway threshold, the creature snapped forward and slammed into the glass with a deep thud that shook the entire facility. I fell backward and scrambled away. The glass moaned under the pressure. Hairline cracks split outward like frost patterns. The alarm system blared. Red lights flashed through the hallway. I didn't wait to see if the window would hold. I ran. My footsteps echoed down the corridor as the facility groaned. I heard the creature dragging itself across the outer hull, slow scraping, testing, searching for weak points. The metal vibrated with each movement. I turned a corner and reached the main security station. The monitors flickered and glitched. The entire east side camera system turned to static. Then the tapping sound started again. This time it came from the wall itself. Not a hatch, not a door. The metal. The creature was following me. I backed into the control chair and tried to calm my breathing. My hands trembled as I pulled up the emergency protocol menu. It required an access code that I didn't have. Only the shift lead had it, and the shift lead was off duty for 2 more hours. I looked around the room. Every screen showed black water and distorted shapes drifting outside. Nothing clear enough to identify. Nothing human. Nothing normal. Then something changed. The tapping stopped. Everything went silent, too silent. I leaned closer to the monitors. The static shifted. A faint outline appeared on one screen. A massive figure drifting outside the east wing. I squinted. The shape moved closer until its glowing eye filled the entire feed. The screen went black. The facility trembled. I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe slowly. I knew what the rules said. I knew what I was supposed to do, but part of me wondered if any of the rules truly mattered anymore. This thing wasn't behaving like an animal. It was watching, learning, reacting. The final rule echoed in my mind. Rule 10. If a creature adapts to your behavior, do not repeat that behavior again. I didn't understand what that meant earlier. Now I did. The creature had followed my fear. It had learned my retreat. It had mirrored my movements outside the window. And now it was testing the structure itself based on how I responded. The facility trembled again. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lights flickered and buzzed. I could feel it. The creature was no longer outside the station. It was around it, circling, studying, choosing the next place to strike. I backed away from the monitors and kept my eyes on the walls. The tapping started again, louder this time, more rhythmic, like a signal, like communication. My heart sank. It wasn't tapping at random. It was knocking. And it wanted something. The knocking did not stop. It echoed through the metal like a dripping heartbeat, slow, measured, intentional. I stood in the control room and listened to each strike. It carried through the deck plates and traveled up my legs. I felt it in my ribs, in my teeth. The creature outside was not trying to break in. Not yet. It was waiting for me to react. I forced myself to stay still. My instincts wanted me to run. My legs shook as I pressed my back against the wall and tried to think. The emergency instructions said to stay inside the control room during a breach threat, but these rules were never written for something like this. They were meant for natural pressure disturbances, faulty seals, standard equipment failure, nothing about a creature that learned your fear. The knocking stopped again. This time the silence made me more afraid than the sound. The monitors flickered. The whole room dimmed and brightened in a slow, rhythmic pattern, almost like breathing. I looked at the largest screen and waited for the static to clear. It never did. The cameras were blind. A low groan reverberated across the ceiling, the kind of noise metal makes when something pushes it too far. I looked up and waited for the lights to shake again. They held steady. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then I heard another sound that chilled me even more. Dripping water. Just a single drop at first, then another. A soft patter behind the maintenance locker. I stepped toward the far corner of the room. My feet were quiet against the grated floor. I reached the locker and placed my hand against the metal door. It felt colder than the rest of the room. I pulled it open. Condensation ran down the interior walls. Not normal condensation. It was too heavy, too thick. I touched it with the tip of my finger and recoiled. The liquid was warm, almost oily. The smell was faint but sharp, like rust and something organic. Something had seeped through the walls. The pressure outside should have kept everything out. Nothing should leak inward unless the hull had been stressed to its limit. I grabbed a cloth from the lower shelf and wiped a line across the metal. More liquid kept forming. It was being pushed from outside. That meant the creature was still near the control room. I backed away and tried to steady my breathing. I needed a plan. I needed to act. Staying here was not safe. The creature had already learned how to find me. The rule about adapting flashed through my mind again. I was starting to believe the warnings were not safety guidelines. They were desperate notes from whoever worked here before me. I moved toward the main console and pulled open the restricted operations menu. The system demanded authorization. I did not have it. I typed a few guesses, all denied. The more I tried, the more I realized the company did not expect anyone at my level to act during a breach. They expected compliance. They expected the rules to be enough. They were not enough now. A heavy thud struck the wall behind the monitors. I turned sharply and waited. Another impact followed, deeper, stronger. The creature was no longer tapping. It was testing the hull. It had grown bold. The hits came closer together, forming a slow rhythm. Each strike vibrated through the consoles and shook the wiring underneath. I reached for the emergency flashlight clipped to the desk, not to use it. Rule 4 said never to shine a light outside during a disturbance. The creature reacted to light. I kept it pointed at the ground and held it tight. The impact stopped again. Silence settled across the station, a heavy silence, the kind that eats sound rather than letting it pass. I strained to listen for anything. A faint hum from the coolant system, the crackle of electrical panels under strain, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. No tapping. No knocking. No movement. I approached the doorway and looked down the hall. The corridor was dim. The overhead lights glowed weakly like they were running out of power. I stepped outside the control room and moved slowly. My boots made soft echoes. Each echo seemed to stretch too far. It made the hallway feel longer than it should. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed something on the floor, a wet trail, thin and uneven. It led toward the pressure gate that separated this section from the outer maintenance ring. I crouched and touched the liquid, warm again. The same oily feel, the same metallic smell. I knew what it meant. The creature had dragged itself across the outer hull near this section. Its body heat, or whatever unnatural warmth it carried, had left a trace through the metal. It meant the barrier between us was not as solid as I wanted to believe. I followed the trail to the pressure gate. The indicator lights were steady, green, no breach, no warning, but the faint drip of warm liquid continued to fall from the upper curve of the doorframe. I stared at the droplets forming and dropping one by one. No cracks were visible, no structural damage, yet something was forcing its presence through. My breath fogged slightly again. The temperature was dropping. The pressure system whined in the distance. The facility was struggling to hold itself together. I decided to move. Standing still felt dangerous. I began walking toward the backup generator room. It was the only place with reinforced plating on all walls. It might buy me time if the creature found a way in. My footsteps echoed as I walked past the storage bay and the emergency diving suits that nobody ever used. When I reached the far corner of the corridor, I stopped. Something was on the floor. A small object, metal, shiny under the flickering light. A security badge. Not mine. I picked it up and turned it over. The name was barely readable. The plastic card was warped and scratched, but the picture showed a man in the same uniform I wore. He should not be here. No one else was supposed to be on this level during night shifts. A cold realization ran through me. This badge was not inside the station. It had been dropped through the wall. I stepped back and scanned the corridor. My pulse quickened. Something large moved behind the outer plating, a ripple of metal, a faint shift in the shadows. The creature was no longer circling randomly. It had chosen its point of entry. The floor vibrated. A deep groan traveled through the beams. Then the knocking returned. Not slow, not testing, urgent, heavy, deliberate. I backed away from the wall and held the flashlight tight. The metal bulged inward as if something powerful pressed against it with intent. The knock came again, stronger. The lights dimmed. A drop of warm liquid fell from the ceiling and hit my cheek. Then I heard something I wished I never heard. A breath. Not mine. A slow inhale on the other side of the wall, deep and hollow. The kind of breath a massive body makes when it fills lungs that do not belong to anything natural. I ran. The corridor twisted with every step. My boots slipped on the wet patches. Alarms began to sound in different sections. The pressure system wailed through the pipes like a warning. I reached the generator room door and slammed my hand against the access pad. It opened with a sluggish hiss and I rushed inside. The door sealed behind me, and the reinforced bolt locked into place. The room was quiet, too quiet, as if the rest of the station had gone underwater in a sudden stillness. I backed into the far corner and kept the flashlight pointed at the floor. The creature struck the outer hull again. The whole station groaned. Then everything fell silent once more. It was waiting. I woke up in my bunk with my throat tight and my ears ringing. The emergency lights still pulsed in the hallway outside, throwing flashes of red through the doorway. I didn't remember getting back to bed. I barely remembered leaving the observation deck. My hands were shaking when I pushed myself upright, and for a moment I felt like the room was tilting under me. The pressure difference did that sometimes, but this felt worse, like something had followed me in my sleep. The radio crackled on the desk. A soft whisper of static. I froze. Then a faint sound pushed through it. Not a voice, more like a wet scraping motion, a dragging, slow and steady. The kind of sound that felt like it was being made right inside the walls. I forced myself to go check the corridor. When I opened the door, the temperature dropped sharply, cold enough that it stung my lungs. The hallway was empty, but there was a trail of water leading away from my door. Not a puddle. Not condensation, a trail, thin, uneven, like something had been pulled along the floor. I followed it in silence, my boots tapping lightly, echoing far too loud in the cramped metal passageway. The trail ended near the elevator shaft, right where the metal grating vibrated from the pressure pumps below. A small dark smear clung to the grate. I crouched down and touched it. It wasn't oil. It wasn't grease. The texture was wrong, almost fleshy, almost like the skin of something that lived too deep to be studied. I wiped it on my uniform and tried not to think about what could leave something like that behind. I called the control room, but the intercom buzzed without connecting. The facility sometimes lost communication between levels, but not during nighttime lockdown. I tried again. Nothing. Just that same wet static. I finally stepped into the elevator and hit the button for level 3, where the operations desk was. The elevator groaned to life, moving slower than normal. As it descended, the lights inside flickered and the metal cables above made strained, snapping sounds. Halfway down, the elevator jerked hard enough to make me stumble. The lights went out for 2 seconds. When they came back on, there was condensation on the inside of the glass window behind me. A clean streak, where something had drawn a line down the fog. I stepped out fast when the doors opened. Level 3 was darker than it should have been. Backup lights glowed a dull orange overhead. The operations desk was empty. No sign of the senior tech who was supposed to be on shift. Papers were scattered across the floor as if someone had rushed through. One of the monitors was smashed. The glass spider-webbed outward like something had struck it from the inside. I checked the hallway cameras. Most feeds were static. A few flickered with half-images of dark corridors. One camera on level 1 showed movement, something big slipping past the storage racks. I leaned closer. The image broke apart every few frames, giving me only glimpses, but it was enough to recognize the shape I had seen behind the glass days earlier. That strange, pale outline, too long, too fluid, too impossible to be real. The creature wasn't outside the facility anymore. It was somewhere inside. A loud metallic bang echoed from the ventilation shaft behind me. A second clang followed, then a dragging sound. I stepped back and watched the metal grate of the vent bend slightly outward. Just a few millimeters, but enough to know something on the other side was testing it. My breath turned to mist in the air. I grabbed the nearest tool I could find. A rusted pressure rod, not a weapon, just something to swing. I backed slowly toward the doorway, not taking my eyes off the vent. It vibrated again, harder this time. The screws holding it started to turn on their own. I ran. The hallway felt endless. Every sound bounced around me. The overhead lights flickered with each step. My boots splashed through thin lines of water across the floor. The banging from the vent followed me, traveling through the ducts above. It moved fast, shifting from one section of the metal to the next as if the creature was crawling through the shafts. I reached the central hub and slammed the door behind me. I locked it, then shoved a heavy cabinet in front of it just in case. The hub was small and circular with control screens around the perimeter. A thick window overlooked the deep trench outside. The lights in the room were steady. No flicker, no cold drafts. I allowed myself one breath. Then the alarm started. A low, distorted siren that I had never heard before. The screens flashed a warning I didn't recognize. Containment breach. Level unknown. Seal all ACCSSWAYS immediately. The message repeated. I checked the facility layout. Every sector was still sealed, but the system kept insisting something had breached anyway. Something the sensors couldn't identify. Something big enough to trigger the alarms, but not big enough to be tracked. The floor vibrated lightly, not from machinery, from movement, heavy movement. I approached the observation window. Outside, the trench was black. Only the faint lights of the facility illuminated the immediate area. A fog of disturbed silt drifted through the water. Something glowed faintly within it. A soft ripple of blue light, almost like veins pulsing. It drifted closer. I stepped back, my hand tightening on the pressure rod. The glow pressed against the outside of the window. It spread, revealing part of a massive forehead, a pale surface, smooth, wet. Then one eye slid into view, the size of a dinner plate. It stared at me with a dim bioluminescent ring pulsing around the pupil. Then a second glow appeared to the right. A third below it. My throat tightened when I realized none of those glows were eyes. They were openings. Dozens of small pores glowing around the creature's head, like breathing vents, each one pulsing with its own rhythm. The creature shifted, its outline barely visible in the darkness. A massive silhouette pressed against the window, stretching wider than the entire hub. The glass began to crack. Just a hairline at first, then two, then more. I backed away fast. The cracks spread like branches across the window. The creature didn't move, it just pressed harder. The overhead lights dimmed. The alarms cut out. Everything went silent. Then the glass groaned like it was about to explode inward. I grabbed the emergency hatch controls and yanked it open. The tunnel beyond was pitch black, but it was the only escape I had. The window behind me cracked again, louder this time. I climbed into the tunnel and sealed the hatch just as a deafening crack echoed through the hub. The creature had broken through, and I had nowhere left to run except deeper into the facility. I spent the rest of the shift checking the cameras again and again. I could not stop thinking about the way the creature moved behind the glass. It felt like it was studying me. The station lights flickered more often now. They stayed off longer with every outage. When power returned, alarms blinked that were not active before. I checked the pressure readings twice to make sure it was not a system glitch. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal. When I returned to the main corridor, the temperature had dropped. My breath came out in small clouds. The air system should not allow that. I pressed my hand to the vent and felt cold air coming through. That only happens during an emergency transition or a lockdown drill. No drills were scheduled. The vent rattled once, then something scraped inside the duct. A long, dragging sound that slowed and stopped. I stepped back and waited. The duct went silent. I checked the maintenance logs on the nearby screen, but there was no activity reported in the ventilation system. I kept hearing the scrape in my head even after it stopped. When I looked up the hallway, something was off. A puddle of water stretched across the floor even though there were no leaks in this section. I followed the puddle with my flashlight until it reached a hatch that should have been locked. Rule 3 warned me never to open a hatch that was wet, but this one was not open at all. It had been forced inward. The metal bent like something pushed from the other side. The water trail led into the dark stairwell below. I pulled back slowly and kept my light trained at the opening. Something rested at the top of the stairs. It looked like a piece of kelp at first. Then it flexed. It pulled itself slightly toward the doorway. I stepped away and reached for my radio. There was only static. A low, pulsing hum threaded through the static. I recognized it. It was the same frequency the creature made in the observation tank. Seeing that hatch torn inwards meant something had left the tank, or something else had come inside from the ocean. I did not know which was worse. My flashlight flickered. When it returned, the shape on the stairs had disappeared, leaving only a thin streak of sea water. I followed protocol and fell back to the emergency office. When I locked myself inside, the room lights buzzed and turned blue. A system message appeared on the panel that I had never seen before. It said incoming environmental breach detected. No details, no instructions. The only thing that updated was the line that listed which rules were currently active. Rule 3 had turned red. I stared at the screen as it flickered. Then the entire station shuddered. The sound came from below. Something heavy scraped along the outer hull. It moved slowly toward my side of the facility. When it reached the far wall, the metal let out a deep groan. I felt the vibration travel through the floor. I turned off the lights in case whatever was outside could sense them. The pressure monitors on the wall changed again, but not in any way that made sense. Numbers drifted up and down like something was interfering with the sensors. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I put my ear against the wall even though I knew I should not. The cold metal hummed with a faint heartbeat rhythm, not mechanical, not human. Something in the deep was echoing through the hull. I forced myself to leave the office and head toward the central hub. If there was a structural risk, I had to report it in person at the comm station. The corridor lights dimmed to half. I moved fast but tried to stay quiet. When I approached the old mess hall, the door was halfway open. I had not touched it earlier. The floor inside glistened as if it had been washed with ocean water. I shined my flashlight in. Every chair had been moved into a circle, not stacked, not thrown, placed. At the center of the circle was a single object, a cracked diver helmet. It was covered in fresh scratches, deep ones. I checked the facility roster. No one was missing. No one had used a diving suit in months. The scratches on the helmet formed a pattern that looked almost deliberate. I did not enter the room. When I stepped back, something shifted behind the kitchen counter, quiet but heavy. I held my light steady. A low ripple of water spread from the shadowed corner. A shape rose slightly, smooth, dark, shining like wet stone. I closed the door slowly and did not wait to see if it followed. The hallway felt longer on the way out. When I reached the comm station, the emergency beacon was active but unresponsive. Every button I pressed returned the same message. Transmission blocked. External interference detected. I tried my radio again. Only that same low hum answered me. It pulsed slowly at first. Then it shifted into short bursts. The rhythm matched the scratches on the diver helmet. The creature was not just moving through the facility. It was communicating. I shut off the beacon, shut off the radio, and shut off the lights. I sat in the darkness and listened. The humming stopped. The station creaked once more. Then everything went completely still. I waited for the next sound, whatever it would be. When it came, it was soft and close, dripping water, not from the walls, from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly. Something stood at the entrance of the comm station. Its outline filled the doorway. Its body dripped onto the floor. The air changed. The temperature sank again. Its head tilted once like it was studying the way I breathed. The rules had changed again, and I was no longer sure how many of them still applied. The creature stayed in the doorway without moving. Water pooled at its feet and crept across the floor in thin lines. I stayed completely still, waiting for any sign that it noticed the motion of my breathing or the sound of my heartbeat. The emergency lights outside the room flickered, giving me only brief flashes of its silhouette. Each flicker showed more detail than I wanted. Its skin glistened like something that had adapted to pressure far beyond what a human body could survive. Long ridges ran across its shoulders. Thin tendrils hung down its arms, dripping slowly onto the floor. I waited for it to step forward, but it remained in the same place as if testing the air. I moved one hand slowly toward the emergency panel under the desk. The panel controlled the inner door seal. If I triggered it, the station would isolate this section. It would trap me inside, but it might buy time until I understood what the creature wanted. Before I could reach it, the creature shifted. The faint movement sent a ripple through the water. One of its limbs brushed against the metal frame. The contact made the whole doorway vibrate. I withdrew my hand from the panel. I had no idea if sealing the door would provoke it. Another flicker of light revealed something else. The creature was not fully solid along its lower half. Its form blurred slightly, as if part of its body remained submerged in water that was not actually present. It stepped 1 foot into the room. The water on the floor rose slightly as though reacting to the movement. I backed away until I hit the far wall. The creature tilted its head again. It felt like it was mimicking me. I glanced at the radio. The static hum stayed silent for the first time since the earlier warnings. The air pressure in the room dropped. My ears popped. The creature raised its arm and paused, as if listening to something deeper within the station. A distant metallic bang echoed through the corridor outside. The creature flinched slightly. The sound repeated, louder and closer. It was not coming from the hallway. It was coming through the walls. Something else was moving inside the station. The creature lowered its arm and turned its head toward the sound. Its tendrils lifted slightly, sensing the vibration. For a moment, I wondered if there were two entities in the facility or if the one in front of me was reacting to an environmental shift. The station lights went out completely. Everything fell into darkness except for a faint blue glow pulsing from the creature's chest. The glow intensified. It took a slow step backward, then another. It did not retreat fully into the hallway. Instead, it leaned against the wall as if waiting for something to pass. The banging through the metal walls grew louder, closer. The creature remained still and alert, focused on whatever moved behind the structure of the station. I pressed myself against the wall, unsure whether I should stay hidden or follow the creature's lead. The banging stopped suddenly. The silence afterward stretched long enough to make every breath loud. Then a deep, resonant groan traveled through the floor. The creature straightened. The glow on its chest dimmed and faded. It stepped out of the doorway and disappeared into the corridor without making a sound. I waited several seconds before moving. When I stepped into the hallway, the air smelled faintly like salt and rust. A thin trail of water led around the corner. Another trail led in the opposite direction, toward the deep lab sectors that had been sealed months earlier. The banging that shook the station seemed to come from that part of the facility. I followed the trail leading away from it. I had seen enough for one night to know danger tended to come from multiple directions. The corridor lights returned but stayed dim. I listened for the creature's movements. Everything stayed silent. When I turned toward the maintenance wing, I noticed something on the floor. A maintenance tablet lay face down. Its screen flickered with alerts when I picked it up. None of the alerts belonged to this section. They listed hull pressure inconsistencies, but the logs repeated one phrase: external contact detected. The logs cycled every 5 seconds, each one with a slightly different timestamp. Something had been brushing the station repeatedly. I carried the tablet while following the water trail. It led past the storage lockers and down a stairwell that normally held no water at all. The trail deepened in the middle of the steps. The lights flickered again when I reached the bottom. I paused and waited for my eyes to adjust. The trail ended at a sealed door. The environmental lock was active. Its panel glowed red. No one should have been able to enter that room without triggering alarms. When I placed my hand on the panel, the red light pulsed once. It changed to yellow. Then it unlocked on its own. I stepped back immediately. The door slid open. The air inside rushed out like the pressure had been unbalanced. I braced myself, expecting some kind of breach. The room remained dry. Nothing came out. A low hum vibrated the walls again. This time it came from inside the room. I entered cautiously. The room's central tank, which once held small deep-sea specimens for study, now sat empty. The glass displayed long, fresh scratches. The scratches formed a series of curved lines similar to the ones I saw on the diver helmet. The lines spiraled around the tank as if something had circled it repeatedly before pushing its way out. The bottom of the tank held a thin layer of brine. I knelt beside it and saw faint patterns in the residue. Patterns that almost looked like symbols. Before I could study them further, a metallic warping sound echoed behind me. I turned quickly. The door had closed. The lock panel blinked. Yellow turned to red again. I approached the door carefully. The panel buzzed each time I touched it, refusing to register my access. The hum in the room deepened. I stepped back and scanned the space for another exit. There was none. The hum grew louder. The tank vibrated. The patterns in the brine began shifting on their own. The curved lines twisted into entirely new shapes. I watched as the brine spread slowly into a single spiral. It stopped abruptly. Then the hum faded. The lights shut off. Total darkness filled the room. My breath echoed in the sealed space. I reached for the maintenance tablet. The screen glowed faintly. A new message appeared on it without me touching anything. Proximity alert, do not move. My hands froze. The tablet flickered and displayed another line. External presence detected above. I looked up. The darkness felt alive. Something pressed gently against the top of the room, bending the metal inward. The pressure increased. A low groan traveled across the ceiling. I held my breath. The metal flexed further. Then the presence moved across the roof. Slowly, deliberate, searching. When it passed over the far corner, the temperature dropped again. My breath fogged in front of the tablet's light. The hum returned at a lower pitch. It vibrated through the floor. Something scraped down the outer wall as if circling the room. The scraping traveled around the perimeter. Then it stopped exactly above the door. The metal dipped slightly. A small crack formed. A thin line of water leaked through. It ran down the door. The pressure against the metal increased again. The crack widened by a fraction. The door rattled once. Then the pressure ceased. Silence returned. The tablet vibrated in my hand. A final message appeared. It knows you are alone. The lights returned. The pressure normalized. The hum vanished. The door unlocked on its own and slid open. I stepped out without looking back. Whatever moved through the station was no longer hiding, and it had begun testing the structure to find the weakest places. If it found one, the entire facility would not survive the night. I moved through the corridor fast but tried not to run. Every step splashed in the thin layer of water the creature had left behind. The overhead lights flickered in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me of the station's heartbeat when the systems were under stress. I wiped condensation off the tablet screen and checked the logs again. The warnings repeated endlessly. External contact, structural stress, hull resonance anomaly. Each alert meant something was brushing the outside of the station, with enough force to trigger sensors that normally only reacted to deep-sea impacts. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. The ventilation system tried to correct the temperature, but it struggled. A low hum echoed through the walls. It reminded me of the sound I heard in the specimen room, except broader and heavier. The kind of sound that carried through metal rather than air. The tablet vibrated with another alert. Hull flex warning. Sector E3. That section was one level below me. The same place the creature had been heading toward. When I reached the elevator shaft, the doors were already open. Cold air poured out of the gap as if something had drained the heat from the lower floors. I held the railing and looked down the shaft. The elevator car sat 2 stories below, stopped between levels. The emergency lights inside glowed dim red. Something wet clung to the cables. I leaned closer and noticed long streaks running down the walls. They weren't scratches. They were patterns. Curved lines, repeating like the symbols I saw in the tank residue. I stepped back and avoided touching the railing again. The symbols formed a message, though I had no way of understanding it. I took the stairs instead. The metal rattled under my weight, reacting more than usual. Pressure outside the station pressed inward with each low groan. My hand tightened on the railing as I descended. Halfway down, a sharp metallic pop sounded from the lower floors. The entire stairwell shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. I froze and waited for another impact, but it didn't come. When I reached the next level, the temperature dropped even further. The air felt dense and heavy, like standing too close to a thick pane of ice. Water pooled across the hallway in irregular shapes. As I walked, small ripples moved away from my steps and continued along the corridor long after they should have settled. The lights flickered again. A pulse traveled down the hallway, dimming each bulb in sequence. The pattern resembled something moving through the cables, triggering each light as it passed. I turned the corner and nearly slipped. A section of the floor had buckled slightly. The metal had risen from pressure below, forming a soft arc. When I crouched to inspect it, my fingers felt the heat of friction, as if the metal had been strained repeatedly. The arcs led all the way to the sealed maintenance hatch at the end of the corridor. The hatch vibrated faintly. Something pressed against the other side. I raised the tablet. No alerts came from this exact location, but the surrounding sectors all showed brief spikes. Hull pressure anomaly, structural resonance, temperature variance. Something outside the walls moved in slow circles, brushing the station with deliberate force. I placed my hand against the hatch. A low, rhythmic pulsing came through the metal. It didn't feel random. It felt like a signal, a pattern, 3 short pulses, a pause, 2 longer ones, another pause, the same sequence repeated. I stepped away from the hatch. The pulses grew louder, then they stopped suddenly. Silence filled the hallway, thick and absolute. I waited for a sound, even the faintest one. Nothing came. When I checked the tablet again, new alerts flooded the screen. Sector F1, Sector F2, Sector F3, one after another. The same message each time, external pressure spike detected. hull integrity compromised. I looked up sharply. The corridor lights dimmed again, but this time they stayed low, barely illuminating the floor. A long groan vibrated the entire level. It traveled down the hallway like a deep breath being pulled through metal lungs. I steadied myself as another impact followed. This one made the walls shake. More dust fell from the ceiling. A distant crack echoed through the structure. I moved quickly toward the next stairwell. The lights flickered in a frantic pattern as if reacting to every shift in the pressure outside. When I reached the stairwell door, I stopped abruptly. The door was slightly open. A thin line of water leaked out from the gap. I pressed my ear against the metal. No sound came from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped in. The stairwell was darker than the hallway. Only the lowest emergency light stayed on. A trail of water ran down the stairs in a winding path, receding into the lower levels. I followed it carefully. The air grew even colder. My breath fogged with every exhale. The steps felt slick under my boots. Halfway down the next flight, a faint splash echoed below. I froze and listened. Another splash. Then another, slower this time. Something moved in the darkness below, not fast, not aggressive, curious, testing each step. I considered turning around, but the pressure spikes outside were growing worse. Whatever moved through the station was already inside parts of it. I descended one more step. The splash below stopped. The stairwell fell silent. I gripped the railing and leaned forward slightly. A dim shape shifted at the bottom landing. I couldn't make out details, only the outline of something large pressed against the far wall. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It watched, waiting for the next motion I made. I stepped backward slowly. The shape remained still. The cold deepened. The emergency light above flickered twice. The shape pulsed faintly with a soft blue glow. The same glow I saw in the creature's chest earlier. But this glow was weaker, more diffused, as if it came from something partially submerged in another layer of space. I took another step back. The shape shifted slightly. Not toward me, but sideways, sliding along the wall without sound. It stopped near the base of the stairs. I raised the tablet again. The screen glitched blue for a moment. When the feed returned, a new message appeared. Maintain distance. Do not engage. The shape pulsed again. The glow darkened. I backed up until I reached the stairwell door. Before I stepped out, the shape moved once more. It pressed gently against the metal rail. The rail bent under the pressure with a soft groan. Then the glow faded. The shape dissolved slowly into darkness. I turned and exited the stairwell. My hands shook slightly. The station alarms remained silent, but I knew the meaning behind the lack of warnings. The systems were overwhelmed. The station no longer registered every anomaly, only the most dangerous ones. I needed to reach the control center before the structure suffered damage it couldn't recover from. As I walked toward the central hub, the walls trembled again. A deep, resonant vibration followed, stronger than before. When I looked at the nearest pressure gauge, the needle had moved past the safe threshold. Another vibration traveled through the corridor, louder, closer. Something outside the station was pushing harder with each pass, testing weak spots, searching for places to break through. The final vibration shook the entire level. I braced myself against the wall. The lights flickered violently. A loud crack echoed from deep within the facility. Then the ventilation system shut off completely. The air grew still. Then the tablet vibrated with a single new alert. External breach likely. The tablet kept vibrating long after the alert appeared. The message sat frozen on the screen. External breach likely. I stood in the middle of the corridor and let the weight of those words settle. A breach at this depth meant only one thing. Water would not rush in slowly. It would crush everything in seconds. I wiped condensation from the screen and forced myself to keep moving. The metal under my boots trembled with a new frequency. Whatever pressed against the hull was no longer testing. It was applying deliberate force. As I approached the central hub, the lights grew dimmer. The panels on the walls showed faint waves of frost forming around their edges. That only happened when the pressure outside the station exceeded safe conditions. The cooling system tried to compensate, causing condensation to freeze in thin patterns. I passed a junction where the frost looked like branching veins stretching across the metal. I brushed my glove against it and felt the cold travel straight through the material. The corridor widened near the central support beams. The floor shook hard enough to make me grab the nearest railing. A low groan echoed through the structure. The groan deepened into a grinding sound. I checked the pressure gauge mounted on the wall. The needle hovered at the critical zone. A shift in the metal rattled the lights overhead. One of the bulbs popped. Shards scattered across the floor. When I reached the door to the control center, a draft of cold air pushed through the gap. I keyed in the access code. The panel blinked red. I tried again. The lock clicked softly but did not open. I leaned toward the panel and heard a faint static hiss from inside the room. I tried the code a third time. The lock finally responded. The door slid halfway open before stalling. I pushed it the rest of the way. The room was darker than I expected. Emergency lights cast a pale blue glow across the consoles. All main monitors displayed warning symbols: pressure variance, structural strain, power reroute failure. The large pressure map of the facility pulsed with red circles around the lower hull. A small window on the side of the room showed the ocean outside. I walked toward it slowly. The glass shivered in its frame. Beyond the reinforced pane, the water outside churned with thick clouds of sediment. The clouds shifted as if something enormous moved past the station. A faint blue pulse illuminated the murk. Then another. I stepped closer. A massive outline drifted across the window. The glow traced along its surface. Curved lines ran down its length. I held my breath. The creature was outside the structure again. It was not alone this time. More glows appeared in the distance. They flickered in slow patterns. I gripped the edge of the console and forced myself not to panic. The station could withstand pressure far beyond normal conditions, but not if multiple organisms pressed against it. The room vibrated. The vibration intensified until the monitors rattled on their mounts. One of the pressure graphs spiked sharply upward. Internal temperature warnings followed. The station's automatic systems began sealing doors in distant sections. I heard the metallic clank of locks engaging down the hallway. A message flashed across the center screen. Hull contact confirmed. Structural deformation detected. I backed away from the window. The glass quivered again. A long streak appeared on the surface of the pane. It was not a crack. It looked like a smear of residue. The same faint bioluminescent patterns from the creature's body. I wiped the surface with a sleeve, but the smear did not move. It shimmered faintly as if reacting to touch. The smear grew brighter for a moment. Then it dimmed. A deep impact shook the entire control center. I stumbled to one knee. The room tilted slightly. A second impact followed, stronger than the first. A third impact sent a shockwave through the floor that caused the ceiling panels to flutter. I crawled to the nearest console and checked the structural readout. The lower hull was being compressed by something large enough to deform reinforced steel. The floor under the control center vibrated continuously now. The vibrations pulsed in intervals. They were not random impacts, they were rhythmic. A pattern I had already heard in the maintenance corridor: 3 short pulses, a pause, 2 long pulses, another pause, the same signal. The station shook again. This time the lights dimmed to almost nothing. A low static hum built inside the room. I covered my ears. The hum grew louder. The glass in the window vibrated visibly. I took several steps back from the window. A dark shape moved past the pane, so close that it pressed against the glass. The pane bowed inward slightly. Tiny cracks formed near the edges. They spread in thin lines across the surface. I stared at the shape behind the glass. The faint glow outlined a large section of the creature's body. I could not see its full form, only the curve of something like a ribbed plate moving slowly as it braced against the station. The pressure graph beeped sharply. Then the sound cut off as the speaker failed. The message remained on the monitor: external breach imminent. I grabbed the backup override panel and attempted to redirect power to the internal stabilizers. The controls buzzed under my fingers. A spark jumped from the interface. I pulled my hand away. The smell of burnt plastic filled the air. The stabilizers failed to respond. The window bowed inward again. One of the small cracks extended across the surface. I took another step back. The water outside darkened as another shape moved into view. The faint glow pulsed again. The pulsing grew faster. The floor trembled in sync with each pulse. I braced myself as the station groaned louder than I had heard yet. The vibration stopped suddenly. The entire station fell into a cold silence. No alarms, no impacts, no hum. Only the faint buzz of emergency lights flickering overhead. I checked the pressure gauge again. The needle hovered 1 mark below catastrophic. My breath came out shaky. The window remained bowed and cracked, but it held for the moment. Another alert appeared on the screen. This one was different. A message I had never seen before. It repeated in a slow loop. Internal presence detected. Origin unknown. The room felt smaller. The cold air pressed against my skin. I turned slowly toward the doorway. The corridor outside was dark, too dark. A ripple moved across the surface of the floor. Water shifted in a thin line as if something passed over it without touching it. The tablet vibrated again. A single sentence appeared. It is no longer outside. The quiet that settled over the hub felt unnatural. Even with the shutters sealed, I sensed something lingering near the edges of the room. I kept staring at the monitor that showed the walkway feed, even though the display remained blank. The motion pings had vanished too suddenly to be comforting. It felt less like the threat had moved away and more like the system had decided to stop recognizing it. When I checked the oxygen levels again, the numbers had dipped further. The decline was slow but steady. That meant the recyclers were not maintaining pressure. They had not failed, but something was interfering with their intake vents. I tried to run a diagnostic, but the system froze. A second later, the lights dimmed. The hum of the air system shifted in pitch. The vents rattled softly before settling into a weak, uneven flow. I knew I had to reach the primary recycler chamber. Without stable oxygen circulation, the facility could suffocate long before the ocean crushed it. The recycler chamber was 2 sections away, near the crew maintenance quarters. I waited a moment to be sure the shutters stayed sealed. Then I unlocked the emergency hatch on the far wall. It opened into the maintenance access tunnel that ran behind the hub. The tunnel was narrow and carried a colder draft. My footsteps echoed against the metal walls. The lights along the ceiling flickered with irregular timing. I kept my eyes forward, but every few seconds I felt something shift behind me, like the air itself bent and straightened. I forced myself not to turn around. The tunnel led straight to the ladder that descended into the lower ring, where the recycler chamber sat. When I reached the ladder, I paused. Something hissed faintly below. The sound was not mechanical. It was too soft and too fluid. I tested the radio again, forgetting it was broken until static scraped through the internal speaker. I clipped it back onto my belt and started down the ladder. Halfway down, I noticed the temperature drop sharply. The rungs felt almost frozen. When I reached the lower platform, I saw moisture clinging to the walls. Frost had formed along the edges of the duct paneling. That should not have been possible. The recycler chamber never dropped below a regulated temperature. A dim emergency light glowed near the chamber door. As I approached, the frost on the walls thickened. My breath formed visible clouds. I placed my hand on the door panel. It was ice cold. The door opened a few inches, then stuck. I forced it wider. The hinges groaned against the frozen frame. Inside, the chamber was filled with drifting fog. Not vapor from machinery, but something denser. It clung low to the floor and moved strangely, more like a slow current than natural airflow. The recycler units along the wall flickered with warning lights. Their intake vents pulsed weakly, as if pulling against a barrier. When I stepped inside, the fog shifted around my boots. The air smelled metallic, not rusty or stale, more like the scent of open ocean water under pressure. I approached the central console and tried to access the vent diagnostics. The screen flickered. A message flashed repeatedly. Flow disruption detected. Source unknown. I crouched near the intake vents. Frost had formed around the edges, but the blockage was not ice. Something darker coated the interior mesh. It looked like shadow mixed with liquid, drifting slightly against the suction. When I reached toward it, the substance retracted like it sensed my presence. The vents responded by pulling harder. The blockage split apart into thin strands that slithered deeper into the duct. I stood quickly. The fog in the room trembled. The temperature dropped another degree. A faint tapping echoed through the ventilation shaft near the ceiling. The sound traveled through the metal like something crawled along the ductwork. I stepped back toward the door. Before I made it through, the overhead vents groaned. Cold air rushed downward in a single burst. The fog scattered and drifted upward in twisting patterns. A shape formed in the mist near the far wall. It was not a figure, but an outline in the shifting air, as if something tall displaced the temperature around it. The frost on the wall behind it began to spread in expanding rings. I backed toward the exit, the shape held in place. No movement, no sound, but the air vibrated and pressure built inside my chest. I grabbed the door, shoved myself through, and slammed it shut behind me. Frost spread along the seam. The temperature in the hallway was still low but breathable. I steadied my breathing and checked the secondary oxygen line. It ran along the ceiling of the hallway, leading toward the auxiliary maintenance room. If the blockage had spread into multiple vents, I had to check the secondary line before the airflow dropped too low. I followed the pipe along the wall. In several spots, frost covered it, but the metal did not appear compromised. As I turned the corner leading to the auxiliary room, the lights above flickered rapidly. A loud metallic thud echoed from deeper inside the facility. I moved carefully. The floor felt uneven beneath my boots. When I reached the auxiliary maintenance room, the door was wide open. A cold draft rolled out. The secondary oxygen regulator sat at the back of the room. Its main indicator light glowed orange. The pressure had dropped but not completely failed. When I stepped in, the cold intensified. My fingertips stung. The vent beside the regulator rattled. I walked over and pulled the panel loose. Inside, the mesh filter was intact, but something had scraped along the interior in long vertical streaks. The frost inside the duct wasn't random. It formed in repeating patterns, almost like fingerprints dragging through ice. A sudden crack sounded behind me. I turned. The floor grate in the center of the room had bulged upward slightly. Another crack. The metal flexed inward as if something pressed from below. I stepped back slowly, keeping my eyes on the grate. It flexed again. A thin stream of cold air hissed out. The grate bent upward in a single sharp motion. I flinched back. Nothing emerged, but the air rushing out carried the same metallic ocean smell from the recycler chamber. The frost on the walls began to spread. The regulator light dimmed. I moved toward the exit. As I reached the doorway, the vent behind me rattled again. This time, the metal warped inward. The duct seemed to collapse around an unseen pressure. The frost crystallized across the grate that had bent upward. Whatever spread through the vents had not left the chamber. It was moving through the entire oxygen system. I ran back into the hallway. The lights shifted from white to red. A soft alarm tone echoed through the corridor. Not a structural breach, not a pressure warning, air quality alert. I needed to get to the emergency air tanks in the central maintenance closet. They would keep me breathing long enough to stabilize the system or retreat to the safe room. As I reached the next junction, the facility groaned. The sound traveled through the walls as if something outside pressed against the hull again. The air recyclers hummed weakly overhead. I heard another faint knock through the ductwork, slow, even, familiar. The temperature dipped again. I started running.